see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Al Kaszniak to talk about how we can build a culture of empathy together. Thank you for joining me, Al.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to first find out a little bit about you. I have your web page here from the University of Arizona up on the screen, which I can bring up. And it says you're doing research on both cognition, human brain cognition, and emotion.
Yes.
And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. Just kind of introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. Well, a very large part of my research career, as well as some of my clinical work and teaching, has focused on age-related diseases of the nervous system, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And simultaneous with that research career, I have been a long-term Zen practitioner. And more recently, as of 2010, received Dharma transmission, so a Zen teacher as well. And those interests have converged in more work that we're doing recently on the development of empathy and compassion in long-term meditators, as well as related kinds of phenomena like attention regulation and emotion regulation in those meditators.
Oh, okay. So you're really studying kind of the brain, kind of scientifically studying the brain, as well as bringing in your interest in mindfulness and how it relates to the brain.
That's correct. Yes, indeed.
Okay. So the way I kind of connected with you is I found a presentation you'd given. It was called Empathy and Compassion, Contemplative Neuroscience Perspectives. And you really gave a whole presentation kind of on the nature of empathy and compassion. And perhaps you could just kind of outline a little bit of that. I mean, people can have it. I have a web page I set up for you, and anyone can actually go to that page. And there's the video, all parts of it, as well as a bit of an outline that I've made of the different points there. So, anyone kind of watching this can go check that out too.
Okay. Well, good. So let me just say a few things in broader strokes. First of all, I like to think about empathy and compassion as, first of all, being markers along a continuum of human capacity and action. And secondly, as really more appropriately being verbs than nouns. So I really see empathy and compassion as processes rather than states or traits of people. And I also am very impressed with some of the research as well as what my own practice has taught me about the multiple components or sub-processes within both of those. So empathy is a feeling with other individuals, whereas a compassion is, I think, taking that feeling with others and moving it toward action in the effort toward relieving someone else's suffering. And if we begin to look at what it is that enables empathic response, that feeling with someone else, we begin to see that it really is a fairly complex set of multiple processes, some of which begin with what we might call affective resonance with another individual. That is, what appears increasingly to be an evolutionarily delivered and automatic response within our own brains and bodies when we see the expressions of emotional experience, whether that's suffering or pleasure in another individual, the same regions in our brain and some of the same peripheral physiologic responses that happen when we are experiencing that emotion get replicated in ourselves when we see that emotion manifest in someone else. And a very large and growing now body of research in what's called social neuroscience has indicated that we share that capacity with a number of other animals, particularly some of the primates, and it also appears perhaps whales and elephants, and that it provides us with a kind of automatic sharing of emotion. But it also appears that kind of automatic emotional resonance isn't sufficient for what we would either call mature human empathy or certainly for compassion. And the other elements that then seem to be necessary are a consideration, a more cognitive kind of level of perception in which we differentiate ourselves from the other, in which we're aware that it's not me really that's experiencing that emotion. So there's some perception of, even though there's commonality, there's some separation, there's me and someone else, and the ability to take the perspective of another individual, coming through what goes by the term of mind reading or theory of mind in cognitive science, something that matures, doesn't seem to come online until about age 4 or so, and then develops further into adulthood. But that lets us be aware of the fact that how we see things is not necessarily how someone else sees them. That contributes to this sense of both self and other, similar but different, and also provides a kind of cognitive control that also matures over time, and that I think is a very important component of the regulation of the emotion that is arisen when we see someone else expressing emotion. And we can see the consequences of what occurs when that does not happen, when that contextualizing doesn't occur, in such phenomena as empathic over-arousal, where an individual will really by it appears taking a self-relevant perspective, failing to appreciate this self-other distinction, begins to resonate internally with narratives of their own experience. It begins to feel as though it's happening to oneself, and then the level of arousal cascades. It increases to the point where it becomes aversive, and one response to that aversive experience is turning away. So rather than it manifesting as compassion, it may manifest as avoidance of another suffering individual. There are other aspects of emotion regulation that I think contribute to mature empathy. And then I think there are also a number of things that we cultivate in adulthood that allow us to manifest compassion out of that empathy. And among the more important ones are stabilizing our attention, so that when that kind of more aversive arousal occurs, we're able to remain with and present to the other individual. And also the ability to consider what are the various possibilities, given the context, given who the other individual is, given the entirety of the situation, for action that may be most skillful in relieving that suffering. And so I've just telegraphed a number of pieces. We could unpack those even further, but the most important point I want to convey is that empathy and compassion are not single things. They're points along a continuum of multiple processes.
Oh, yeah. I really love how you're kind of looking at this. You're kind of getting into the nuances and kind of breaking it down, because a lot of times empathy is just defined as standing in someone else's shoes. And
Mm-hmm.
there's really a whole lot to it. There's a,
Yeah.
and we're starting to look at the definition of, what is empathy, how does it work, kind of in a step-by-step process within the
Uh-huh.
brain, and really starting to kind of unpack that. And I think there's a real need for more clarity around definitions. About what empathy and compassion are. And for example, I interviewed Dan Batson just recently, and he's
Yeah.
kind of laid out like everybody's using kind of the word a little bit differently.
Right.
Sometimes they're using the word empathy, empathetic concern, and it might overlap with compassion or it might overlap with sympathy. So it's a little bit of and I talked to Paul Ekman, and he was interested in compassion. And he said, well, to get to compassion, you have to go through empathy. And I was looking at the empathy, the literature on empathy, and it's a morass. so,
Uh-huh.
so it's really, there's this work that needs to be done, it seems to me, to kind of gain clarity and, kind of break down this continuum that you're talking about. So I think it's really important, kind of what you're
Yeah. Yeah.
addressing here.
Yeah. And there is quite a bit of both divergence and confusion about how the different terms are being used. And it's one thing that I found as I read the literature very important to always pause and consider how is this particular author or researcher using these terms, because otherwise it can be quite misleading.
Yeah. So it's when we talk about empathy, we need to kind of like define what is it that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that, well, maybe one is right, one is not right. And when I talked to Marco Iacoboni, he said we really need an academic or a scholar to put them all together because they're all part of the whole, and they're just speaking to different parts
Mm-hmm.
along the continuum. So.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so I think this is really kind of exciting. I really get excited about this, what you're addressing. So this is kind of the framework that you're using for empathy, but you're just laying out. That's kind of your model
That's
for,
correct.
okay.
That's the lens through which I'm viewing it, and of course that's not to say that there aren't other components that we just haven't considered.
Mm,
I think it's also premature to think that we understand how it is that these different components interact with each other, because we have evidence that they are related. So, for example, this resonance component I talked about, which probably it appears is dependent upon what are called mirror neurons in the brain, by which our perception and action are tightly linked. So when we see someone else behaving, doing a particular thing, the same areas in our brain that would be activated if we were doing that thing are also activated in our perception. It's clear that, for example, that has an empirical correlation with the degree of empathy that people self-report in questionnaires. But what we don't understand precisely is what's the nature of the process that links those things. And that's where I think some of the real excitement in research on this today occurs.
yeah, and are you doing some of those studies, like kind of doing tests on this and trying to unravel, get insights into how the process works?
Yeah, so one of the things, a study that we started some years ago and published the first larger report on in 2006, and now are continuing to analyze that data, looked at shorter and longer term meditators, both what's called Vipassana as well as Zen meditators. The shorter individuals who were practicing from 5 to 10 years, and the longer term 10 years plus. And we saw some really interesting differences between those groups in their response to particularly disturbing and strongly arousing emotional scenes. We were interested in emotion regulation and the role that plays in compassion that is cultivated in these kinds of practice traditions. So one of the observations was that while those shorter term meditators were utilizing a lot of what I would call cognitive control, reappraising emotional situations in other kinds of terms, contextualizing it, paying very close attention to what arises in the body as subtle signals for their emotion response. When we looked at the longer term meditators, they were no longer doing those things. And it really began to appear that something quite fundamental had changed for them. And the evidence we obtained suggested that what changed occurred very, very early in the processing of that emotional information, such that if we showed them these arousing emotional scenes for only 40 milliseconds and we sandwiched that image with a kind of visual noise before and after, so you can't have any conscious perception of it, and it truncates the processing of that information, we still saw differences for those long-term meditators. They had less activation of some of these, frown muscles in the face, greater overall activation of so-called smile muscles. They also showed lower autonomic physiologic arousal, where we measure sweat gland response on the fingertips, all of which suggests that what happens for them is really a kind of fundamental change, I think, in how one appraises the self-relevance of events. And perhaps along with the claims of the parent traditions of these practices, a real change in the sense of self no longer being seen as individual, isolated, permanent, having a kind of irreducible essence.
Okay, so it's that the meditation is somehow changing maybe your sense of self. I mean, I'm just going to try to reflect it here, what I'm hearing. That is, you're seeing maybe your sense of self as kind of like more open and encompassing and more spacious of all of experience.
Right, and interdependent.
And interdependent. Okay.
Yeah, really, a self that is the sort of center of gravity of one's experience, but not reifying that sense into, a narrative story that, I am thus and such, and I always have been and always will be. Really seeing the kind of changeable and interconnected nature of all of our experience. And I think that makes a difference in particularly our perception of what is of potential threat. Mm-hmm. Fewer things become threatening. And of course, we have a lot of evidence that threat and the response of fear is one of the inhibitors of compassion. It narrows our attention to only that which is self-relevant.
I was thinking before we kind of continue kind of exploring this, that perhaps I could share kind of the model I'm using for empathy, that I think that might help to kind of synchronize the different models.
Wonderful.
So the model I'm using is empathy, roughly as being 4 components or 4 processes. And I've kind of created this by, I've interviewed so many people and, created this website, Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and looked at so many of these different qualities and trying to synthesize them for myself. And what I've come up with is the first part is self-empathy, that it's about kind of that sensory awareness, mindfulness of what's going on inside my own body, my own sense of felt experience. And that the processes like meditation is kind of help that process of, coming and seeing what's going on. And the arts are a lot about that too. Like I do freestyle dance, and there's all these exercises that are about really getting the nuances of felt experience and becoming more and more aware.
Uh-huh.
And then the second part is, I call it the mirrored empathy, but from the academic literature, it seems like the emotional empathy or affective empathy, and it's kind of that mirroring quality. How much and as I see your head shake, an acknowledgement and a slight smile come, I can feel that kind of come through my body as a felt experience. And the calmer, relaxed, more open, more spacious I am, the more I can kind of take in that experience. And then there seems to be a third component, which is the academic community seems to call it cognitive empathy or perspective taking. I kind of
Mhm.
like the word imaginative empathy. It's like being able to imagine myself in your situation. It's like seeing myself as a separate being from you in the sense of different experiences, and that I know that you're, a professor. You probably, maybe there's you know, situations that you're involved in, you're doing teaching or you're doing research. So I have all that kind of picture of your experience. And then the fourth part is empathic action, that, as we kind of resonate with each other and kind of have that sense of connection, it's easier for us to do things together in a kind of in a harmonious, active way, which tends to be about kind of negotiating, holding our humanity, in each other's hands in a sense, and kind of as we do some kind of a negotiation, kind of consider how the other is and kind of have this negotiated active component in. And then what I hear, kind of the thing that happens is from the mindfulness community, they're always talking about that action component being related to to uh, to suffering. But it seems to me that it's like 80% of our experience is about joy, it's about creativity, it's about all this other stuff, and we're constantly negotiating with each other empathically to
Mhm.
do this part. So only a fraction of our consciousness is kind of spent on kind of being aware and focusing on other suffering. And that's for me how compassion kind of comes in. That compassion is like a subset and a slice of the that empathic experience, and it's that empathic experience applied to kind of suffering. If I see you suffering, how does my empathic, all those components kind of relate to interact with the awareness of your suffering? So that's a little bit of the model I'm using. I'm just wondering how that kind of resonates with your.
I think it. First of all, you articulate that model very well, and I much appreciate the kind of wording that you put to it, because I think it really helps people get a sense of that. And the second thing I'd say is that I think it's very consistent with much of what we're learning from the science, as well as looking at contemplative traditions and what they have had to say about empathy and compassion. That first component, I think, is really an important one. And I often use the term attunement as a way to express the same thing. And I do think that much of meditative practice, as well as the kind of contemplative movement arts, are ways of getting more familiar with those subtle bodily signals that so often are the first inklings of our resonating with other individuals. And also what lets us know when empathy is changing over to empathic distress or empathic over arousal, because it's, I think, the ability to sense those changes in our own internal state, that if we can do so and kind of capture them when they're early and they're subtle, we can do various things that shift that energy. Whereas if we're not very aware of what's going on internally, I think it's very easy for that arousal to reach a threshold where then it's very, very difficult to downregulate it. It becomes problematic then. So I think that is terribly important.
Yeah, so what I'm really looking at is how do we create a culture of empathy? How do we kind of promote, foster, nurture this kind of awareness and this sense of connection at a cultural wide level? And some of the components of that, one is like, it's nice if we have a general definition that we kind of know what we're talking about. So,
Uh-huh.
so I really love, and I can see that you know this. I think it's so important what you're doing is trying to break apart the components and really, you know, so we can really break down the kind of unpack it and look at the individual components, and then kind of what I'm hearing you say is that one of the blocks, there's a whole series of what are the things that kind of block us from having that sense of connection with each other, and that the kind of the over arousal is one of these things that actually inhibits our connecting. We become overwhelmed with stimuli or anxiety or fear or whatever, and that kind of, you know, shuts us down. And I'm hearing you say that it's by being attuned to ourselves and being aware of, oh, I'm starting to get overwhelmed right now. There's a little overwhelm happening, and to be conscious of when that kind of happens. And then what do we do then? It's like once we have that awareness, what do we do with that awareness?
Hmm. Well, I think it's there that also, you know, various practices, various things that people can cultivate through practice in the same way that we, you know, we cultivate athletic skill through practice or musical skill through practice, begin to become very valuable. And again, I think it, you know, the earlier that one is able to be sensitive to those changes in arousal, the more easily and more successful that downregulation can occur. But even if one, you know, finds oneself in the, you know, the intensity of fear or the fire of anger, there still are things that, you know, interestingly, I think many of our grandmothers knew very well about, you know, counting to 10
Mm.
before acting. The attunement that you started off talking about your model in describing this kind of self empathy, sensing what's going on inside the body, is another tool in and of itself. Because, you know, all of the evidence points to our being the kind of organisms that are limited channel capacity information processors. And that's just a fancy way of saying we can't do too many things at the same time. We can maybe shift rapidly between different things, but basically we, you know, we have a kind of working memory capacity that holds a very few number of things. And if I am finding myself aroused and feeling that aversion that is beginning to turn me away from someone else, focusing upon the body does two things. Number one, I can't be processing the narrative of how this is so terrible and relevant to me, and boy, that's like when, you know, I had this awful experience in the past, because we can't do those multiple things at the same time. If I'm processing the body, I'm not generating that narrative. And the other thing it does is by, you know, using our capacity for consciousness to be aware of that bodily arousal, one of the things that consciousness seems to do is creates integration. It connects various things up together. So suddenly, you know, when we talk about spaciousness of awareness, I think what we're talking about really is the capacity to integrate multiple things together. And our awareness, our consciousness does that, you know, both at a neurophysiologic level and at a metaphoric level.
Yeah, so I've heard a little echo there. I have to talk softly. I'm still hearing the echo. It'll go away. Okay, so it's it kind of distracted me a little hearing that echo. So it's really kind of seeing how we can kind of do the if we have consciousness of what's going on inside of ourselves, we feel ourselves becoming kind of overwhelmed. And I guess it's that quality of the integration, you know, of how we kind of can integrate. We're wanting to. I just interviewed somebody before this, and she was talking about being a highly sensitive person, right? And for her, relationships were kind of like a tsunami, right? She used the word tsunami, and and she would feel overwhelmed just by other people's emotions, and she had to find a way of shutting down that. And she would
Mhm.
use judgment. It's like if you judge somebody, it seems to be a way of creating a block, a
Uh-huh.
cognitive block. And it's kind of this quality of, how do we not, how do we deal with that tsunami? Which it
Yeah.
seems like kind of what you're talking about. It's like, how do we create that, deal with that tsunami? And it's kind of like through, self-awareness and there's all these practices that we can do to actually practice and nurture that state of empathy.
Yeah. Things we can cultivate that let us stay present and engaged with the other individual, because so many of the strategies we either are taught or fall upon, that using of judgment that creates a wall, defines the person as different from us, or the various ways we create stories that make someone else into the other, whether it's the other who is different because of their ethnicity, or the other who is different because of their nationality, or the other who is different because of their political beliefs. That's the first step in demonization. And demonization is a guarantee for shutting off empathy and compassion.
And the other is seeing someone as separate from yourself, I guess is another word. It's like
Yeah.
if we're mirroring each other through the mirrored empathy, a culture of empathy is where we're constantly in this state of reflecting and mirroring each other's feelings and deeper senses, and that the other is when we stop seeing that we're kind of connected and we're kind of creating a wall somehow, like you're somebody else, you're something else than me.
Yeah. Yeah, and this business of how we make judgments about other people. Tanya Singer, a neuroscientist in Germany, doing some very interesting work on empathy, and she studies the brain. And there are particular areas. There's no such thing as an empathy center in the brain, but there are particular areas of the brain that are more activated during empathy, when someone, for example, is seeing another in suffering. But in a recent study, when the men in this study perceived other individuals as being unfair, in other words, they made a judgment about their behavior as unfair or as ill motivated, those areas did not activate when they were watching the other person in their suffering. So I think we can see reflected in the brain that kind of shutting off of the process of empathy when we make certain kinds of judgments about others.
Yeah, something I was wondering about is, justice and kind of the underlying sense of fairness. That fairness could almost be seen as feeling that you are not willing to empathize with me anymore, so I need to shut off my empathy as well.
Uh-huh.
Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like,
Yeah. When we think it's not going to be reciprocal,
mhm.
that is certainly one way in which we define someone else as unlike ourselves, as sufficiently different that they cannot be trusted. And a number of things that point to the evolution of our empathic capacity as really starting with those closest to us, evolving for kin and group, and only really in humans evolving to where we can use our cognitive capacities to expand that to other individuals, even with whom we're unfamiliar. Reading a story in the newspaper, for example, of something happening thousands of miles away that engenders an empathic response.
Yeah, and it's that quality you mentioned about regulation, that you're saying that there's this quality of kind of self-regulation, that
Mm-hmm.
if we're empathizing with us, there's this sense of the connection and then also boundaries, right? So
Yeah.
there's this sense of a kind of an ongoing kind of negotiation with
Yeah.
others. And
Yeah, and as you're gesturing it, I think it communicates very accurately. It's a kind of a dance.
so the dance is almost like a great metaphor
Yeah.
kind of empathy and it's like, well, I guess one question is in terms of building a culture of empathy, what is our intention? Why would we have the intention for wanting to build or foster empathy? It's like,
Yeah.
why not just block ourselves off and it's all about me, and this is a good way of being, and I'm going to look out for myself. Why would you even want to empathize? What's the underlying motivation, and why would you want to do it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question. And I would say the first thing is that, even if we accepted the premise that what is good for the self is all that's sufficient, it would still be an unskillful strategy to be concerned only with self and not with others. One of the things we're learning about empathic concern or compassion as it manifests in altruistic behavior is that our altruism not only aids someone else, but it's health enhancing for ourselves. So, it feels good to do good for others, and it also has physical correlates, health enhancing correlates. Our immune system responds positively to it, our general physiology responds positively. And the second thing, of course, is that we are intimately social beings. There is no sense in which we can come into the world or survive in the world in isolation. It just can't happen. And to that extent, then, we are very dependent upon other individuals. And so one of the things that empathy and compassionate response, does is it enhances our social communication, and it enhances our social bonding and our cooperation. And when groups cooperate, all of the individuals within and between those groups benefit.
Yeah, so it's almost like we're kind of wired. I mean, one reason that we want a culture of empathy is because it's our nature, that we're kind of like biologically wired as social beings to interconnect with each other.
Exactly.
And it's just like hunger. It's like, I have a hunger pain that's telling me, hey, it's time to eat. My body needs food. That there's pains that come up when we're disconnected. We feel loneliness, and it's saying, hey, it's really important that we connect with each other. So it's just like a biological kind of imperative.
Yeah, at a very fundamental level.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do we kind of nurture? What are we going to do to kind of nurture? And there's, it kind of, there's a lot of people who say, no, we're all separate beings. We're separate. We have to look out for ourselves. And, you got to think about number one, and there's plenty, and they have arguments, maybe even political strategies or philosophies kind of built around that. So
yeah.
What about that?
Well, first thing I would say is that when I hear such people talk and I watch them, they don't impress me as being particularly happy. And so, one of the things that I think is useful to take into account, as all of us struggle to, get our heads around, what is the way we want to live in the world, particularly in our 21st century world. A very useful data point for me is always, does the person who's articulating a particular philosophy or belief look happy? And those who don't, I want to pause and say, well, to what extent is the living of that belief contributing to that person not being very happy? I think the other thing is that we can get so easily misled by the kinds of signals that surround us that encourage a kind of self-perspective or a self-isolation. And some of those come through, advertising media. that have the motivations of encouraging us to, behave in certain ways that, result in greater profit for whoever it is that's conveying the message. But I don't know about you. I haven't found that, the accumulation of objects or their symbols like money, it may give a little burst of feeling good for a very short amount of time, but it certainly doesn't result in any kind of sense of lasting happiness.
Yeah, it's when we're kind of at the end of our lives and look back, you always hear about people talking about, what was important to them. It was their sense of connection with others. It wasn't
Exactly.
like, hey, I got a new BMW or
Yeah.
another 1,000 square feet on my house or something.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a meditation teacher you probably know of, Jack Kornfield, who tells a story about the funeral of a very wealthy person. And as the casket is being lowered into the ground, someone else turns to one of the other mourners and says to that person, "Well, how much did he leave behind?" And the other person says, "Everything, everything."
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. So, any other thoughts about building a culture of empathy and I guess compassion as well?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, because that's really what I'm looking at is how do we, kind of raise this as a societal value and
Mm-hmm.
so kind of looking for any kind of insights or
Yeah. So I really see three things, and it doesn't exhaust the universe of all that would be skillful in doing that. But one of them is the kind of work that you're doing, communicating the value and the kind of rational sensibility about empathy and compassion more broadly, and utilizing our modern channels of communication to do that. I think that's very, very important. Because it not only makes the information more available to people, it allows people to consider these questions, but also it makes it clear that they're questions that cut across beliefs and religions, and so nobody has a special purview or ownership of empathy and compassion. They have their roots in all of our biological inheritance. They're equally accessible by all of us. The second thing I think is making more available to people the opportunity to learn about the practices that can cultivate empathy and compassion. And then the third thing is learning about the kinds of things we can each do to help minimize the inhibitors or obscurers of our empathy and compassion. So we talked about fear, we talked about self-relevant perspective taking, we talked about ways of being able to manage empathic over-arousal when it occurs. Those are all skills that can be cultivated as well. And then, just as with making the general questions about empathy and compassion more broadly available, making those opportunities for learning the skills more broadly available.
Yeah, so I was hearing kind of the initial part is kind of creating this dialogue. I mean, I'm kind of using the word dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but as I've asked people about how do we build a culture of empathy, they said, just start a conversation about it. Get people talking and thinking about it. And then it seems to me that's kind of what you were saying, kind of the
Yeah,
first part. And
yeah,
then kind of starting to look at kind of how does it work? What's what are the components of it? So that was the first part. The second part was kind of like education. It's like, okay, now we know kind of how it's working. How do we create kind of a curriculum of
right,
empathy? It's like,
right.
what are the steps to creating empathy? Is that kind of your second part? Did I
That's
get it?
correct.
And then the third part is really see what the blocks are. What are the things that are blocking us from connecting with others, and then be able to find maybe strategies and approaches for dealing with each of those kind of blocks.
Very well put.
Oh, great. So that's the program we got to create. So it sounds like we. So how are we doing on that kind of at a societal level? You know, how do you see that kind of playing out? What do we need to do next?
Yeah. So I think, you know, it really is a good news and bad news situation we're in. So I'm very encouraged by, I mean, just the fact of, you know, people doing what you're doing. And, you know, there's an increasing number of people who really are interested in this and who are initiating. I just came back, for example, from a retreat and training program last week at Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe called Being with Dying. An enormously, I think, valuable effort in training end-of-life healthcare and social service professionals in doing exactly what we're talking about, cultivating these skills that can amplify empathy and compassion and reduce the things that interfere or with or obscure it. So I think that's all really good news. Lots of information being disseminated, lots of opportunity being created. At the same time, we have forces in our various cultures that kind of, you know, push us more toward greed and self-preoccupation, and often without our awareness of the extent to which those forces are really powerful. So I think it's going to be a very interesting next decade to see how those kind of countervailing trends in our society play out.
So you're saying that there's kind of different forces within society, that there's kind of like obstacles and to empathy, kind of societal obstacles that we're going to need to find ways of overcoming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you don't know how it's going to play out. Sounds like the jury's out for you.
I think it is. Like most of us have a positivity offset. I'm inclined to see the glass as being half full rather than half empty. But the reason why, at least personally, I find it important to stay with that kind of don't know mind is that it reminds me that there's work to be done, that one can't assume because the ball is rolling and there's a trend toward greater recognition of the importance of empathy and compassion, that it's all going to work out okay, because there are these countervailing forces, and it means that we need to increasingly be mindful of them and think hard about what is it that we can do to both see clearly how those work and to find ways without demonizing, without villainizing, be able to resist those in ways that embody empathy and compassion as we're resisting.
Yeah, so the means are the end, kind of. Yeah. So how do you see your work now continuing? What's next up for you in terms of your research and your study and your interest in the next years?
So we have some ongoing studies, that some of which are looking at the impact of fear, particularly of existential fear of death, on empathy and compassion, and the kinds of things that can decrease, especially practices that can decrease that fear and its impact. We have other studies that look at the effects of short-term training in attentional modulation and emotion regulation through contemplative practices, and how those impact not only on empathy for others, but on self-empathy, as you described it, and kindness that involves not only others, but ourself as well. So those are ongoing, and we're looking forward to as the results become available to seeing what story those tell us. The other thing I'm wanting to spend time on is more integrative kind of work. I'd really like to parse some time to think deeply and reflect about all of what's going on, and at least take my own shot at integrating it together for not only the satisfaction that comes of that, but hopefully of that being of some service to others.
The last part was integrating all the material that you've learned
Yeah,
into a kind of a coherent
yeah,
understanding. Uh-huh.
yeah. Really more of a book length kind of treatment of that.
Well, I was really fascinated by I really perked up when you mentioned fear, because
Mm-hmm.
it seems to me that the fear is really one of the major components that's like a block to empathy. That
Mm-hmm.
if we can really find ways of addressing fear, that it's just so central. And I have a story that just very quickly can recount, is that I do this freestyle dance, which I mentioned. And once
Uh-huh.
within the dance, I was like just aware of my body, and I just felt my own anxiety, my own fear, and I felt it as a felt bodily experience, because the dance is a very emotional felt
Yeah.
experience, and I could feel it as kind of like a spike kind of going through the core of my being. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, usually I just kind of ignore it, go try to have fun or whatever. And I said, well, I want to really be present with it. I want to not just see it at a distance, but get close to it, kind of let it. I want you to feel, I say fear, I want you to feel my consciousness. I want to really see, feel. Not in an uh, analytic way. I want to feel you as a felt bodily experience to the fullness of whatever you've kind of got to say.
Uh-huh.
And so I found that as I danced and moved and got closer to it, that specific fear, which was like a kind of a spike kind of feeling, kind of like dissipated, and
Uh-huh.
almost and kind of like just it disappeared.
Uh-huh.
And that, but within about 4 or 5 seconds, a whole new fear appeared, and it was like a fear of more of a kind of a heavy, oppressive, controlling fear that was more like a weight kind of
Uh-huh.
coming down on me. So I said, okay, there's the weight. I want to get close. I want to feel you in your full, essence.
Mm-hmm.
And as I did that, they kept moving, getting closer. It kind of dissipated. And then there was someone that I would try dancing with, a woman, and all the time when I'd kind of start dancing, she would like turn and leave. So I had this anxiety about dancing with her because of this sense of rejection, right? So I had a
Uh-huh.
fear of that rejection. I said, okay, I'm going to dance with you. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to get really close to that fear of the rejection, which had a whole different contour to it. And as I
Mm-hmm.
got close to it, it kind of like dissipated. And within 3 or 4 or 5 seconds, a new one came up, but I kept getting closer and closer to it. And it going towards that fear kept us in relationship.
Uh-huh.
And we had this like wonderful dance. And then I went off and danced with others and was looking. I was like, looking, where are the fears? I want to find the fears, you know? And I found that as the more I kind of faced and engaged the fears, it's like my body kept relaxing and relaxing and getting softer and softer. And to the end, I mean, this is one of those peak experiences. I haven't been able to replicate this all the time. But at the end, I felt so calm and so relaxed. And so, I mean, it was like a beautiful, it's almost tearful kind of a feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I really saw that as that aspect that you're talking about, the essences of fear. Like, we tend to maybe think of fear as one component, but the fear has so many, it seems to have unlimited aesthetic manifestations. And like, how do we relate to the fear? Do we cut it off, see people as other, you're an idiot, you're not going to dance with me, you're stupid, or or do we go to it? Or so it's this whole notion of how we relate to fear. So that's kind of coming at it from an experiential. And it
Yeah, yeah,
really, really, I thought this is so central to the essence of empathy, is how we relate to fear. So I got really excited when I heard you saying that you're
yeah.
kind of studying this and kind of wanting to hear
Wonderful,
more about it.
wonderful description, and a great description of how um, just that being with consciously the embodied experience of fear, or for that matter, any other kind of what we sometimes call destructive emotion, like anger, liberates those emotions. You talked about them as dissolving. Consciousness is the solute for those kinds of unpleasant and unskillful emotional experiences, because of, I think, again, its ability to allow integration. When we get afraid and we become afraid of the fear and we wall off the fear, it kind of preserves it in encapsulation and keeps it alive, and doesn't allow it to liberate, doesn't allow it to dissipate in the way that all things do. Fear and anger are impermanent, just like every other kind of experience, save for when we actively, hold them alive, either by feeding them with a narrative or by blocking them off.
Yeah, so it's you mentioned like letting them dissipate, but it sounds like there's a quality what's actually might be happening is it's being integrated into our being. We're kind of
Yeah,
like integrating it in some emotional being. I mean,
sure.
it's like it's almost like it transforms. It takes
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We in the tradition I practice in, we have something called the Bodhisattva vows, which we chant in each evening of a meditation retreat. And one of them is delusions are numberless. I vow to transform them. I think it captures that sense you're communicating. That there's one experience that, I mean, we consider these delusive in the sense that the fear is about something symbolic. It's not as though there was a tiger in the room while you're dancing and you got an appropriate fear response. It's the kind of things our minds generate in the stories that we tell, and they're endless. One dissolves, another one arises, but simply being with them, I think, is transformative.
What is your research going to be doing? How are you approaching the nature of fear, and what's your
So
exploration?
we utilize things, in the laboratory that we can, kind of have some control over, because that's the nature of science. And so most frequently what we do is we utilize images that have a kind of biologic linkage to fear. So they're often of, threatening, snarling animals or spiders or snakes or those kinds of things where we're biologically prepared to respond in fearful ways. And those allow us to be able to, generate, of course, lower levels of fear. We don't try to scare the dickens out of people in the lab, but they let us then, by using very subtle physiologic measures, begin to study what is it that happens when you attend to something that's fearful. What is it that happens when you shift your attention? And therefore to begin to learn things that we can generalize from outside, to outside of the laboratory as well.
Okay, so you're kind of wiring people up to see what's the body response when someone's feeling fear. How can we kind of measure the bodily responses through, I don't know, is there some electromagnetic, or are you
Yeah,
measuring like oxytocin or cortisol, or,
we do some studies where we measure cortisol and other, so-called stress hormones. We do some measurement of the electrical reflections of the autonomic nervous system. So in skin conductance, that measures what happens when more sweat occurs at the skin surface, and it conducts electricity. We look at heart rate and its variability. We look at the subtle changes in the muscles of facial expression. All of those are ways to almost like a biologist uses a microscope, ways to amplify our sensory perception so that we can see things that are subtle.
Mm-hmm. And then how are you interacting with the fear? Are you kind of finding strategies? It's like, okay, let's test if we go to the fear, what happens? If we avoid the fear, encapsulate it, what happens? Kind of what's the dynamic of how you're testing fear?
So we for example, in one study, which utilizes different ways of instantiating emotion regulation. So as one just easy example, one strategy that we sometimes use as humans is to block the expression of that emotion. So if you're interacting with your boss, and you don't want to let your boss see that you're afraid of some task you've been assigned, you may stone face, keep the person from being aware. Another strategy might be to really experience that fearful emotion and put it in some kind of a context. Maintain your awareness in a more open way of, what is the situation? What is is there really any active threat to me? And that's something we call reappraisal. Those have very different physiologic consequences. The former resulting in greater arousal, actually, greater arousal physiologically. The latter really being something that both subjectively and physiologically seems to calm the arousal. So that's one example of the kind of thing we try to do.
Oh, cool. Yeah, well, that's great. I love this kind of research, I don't know, I have something about the whole scientific, how it kind of works. And kind of combining that with the arts too, I think is, and I think empathy, I think it was Via Chandram or something. He said that empathy is kind of the handshake between science and the humanities.
Yeah.
It kind of integrates the two, and kind of, so I'm kind of really excited about kind of the work you're doing.
Arts, dance, music, really have an enormous amount to teach us, and I think we're just beginning to see some of the appreciation for that within science.
Well, I've loved this conversation. Could go on and on and on. I hope we can maybe continue it, kind of explore some more nuances, and kind of go into depth in some subject, or perhaps do a panel together with some others, and
that'd be wonderful.
Kind of keep the conversation going.
Good. I very much enjoyed it, and thank you for not only your efforts but all of your own insight. I think it's just extraordinarily helpful.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Real pleasure.
All right.
Okay.
Good
take care, Al.
You take care as well.
Talk to you soon.
Bye now.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.